Welcome back to Design and Thrive Studio. We have a podcast with Jeff Williamson, all the way from Detroit, Michigan, and he's with VisionWare X. So, hey, Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, can we begin? Let's start with this. What inspired you to venture into this intersection of education, healthcare, and technology?
Yeah, it was a circuitous route. I'm not a educator. Both my parents were educators, but I'm not an educator. I'm a classically trained scientist. So it doesn't make sense necessarily at this stage why I'm in the space that we're in. But a few years ago, actually in 2020, February 10th, I remember the date distinctly well. We launched a product in the AR space, augmented reality space, and it was catering to the optometrist world, the virtual try-on of glasses. You're probably familiar with Warby Parker and virtual try-on. We had the most accurate virtual try-on tool available. And February 10th, 2020, you might remember, a pretty monumental week in world history with COVID hitting. And for about 10 straight days, we were in no man's land. What's going on? No responses to anything, any email, any phone call. The world went upside down on us. But it turned out to be a big blessing in disguise, because manufacturers couldn't get visibility of their product to trade shows. Trade shows were off the table, and we also got bottom up pressure. Clinicians, optometrists at the local levels who did not have access or didn't even own websites or e-commerce sites or very little social media recognized that traditional marketing paradigms were out the window and they had to go electronic or they're going to die on the vine. So we listened to the market. They started calling us after about 10 days. And we listened to the market for a good solid 6 months, improved the product, added in some other really unique functions and features. And we fully launched in June of that year. And in that conversation with the clinician of all places in South Africa, I had my first major pivot. 15 minutes into the conversation of describing this augmented reality platform, I simply asked the clinician, her name was Mariki, what can be done to help you out in a clinical environment regarding virtual reality, not augmented reality? And she struggled with that because in 2020, what is a VR system? It's a gaming unit, right? Perceptually. And well, I don't know, Jeff. I don't know how I'd ever use it from a clinical scenario. And I'm like, well, let me ask you this. What if I told you I could track your eyes in 2 fractions of a second where they're focused in on screen? And she struggled with that. And then she simply said, well, now you're dealing with reading. And I almost fell out of my seat. She didn't finish her sentence. I said, oh my God, do we have the ability to screen and diagnose something like dyslexia? Are they reading up, down, left, right, diagonal in real time? And she stopped me mid-sentence and she said, well, do you know how you treat dyslexia, or at least one of the ways you treat dyslexia? And I said, no. And she said, well, one of the ways you treat them is with lenses, colorimetric lenses. So across the spectrum, and there's essentially 12 different lenses from yellow, blue, purple, red, green. And we find a lens that works for you. And it does improve, doesn't cure, but it certainly improves efficacy for reading for these individuals. And I said, are you kidding me? And she said, no. And I'm like, well, the reason why I baited the question to begin with is that we had been working on lens simulation in a virtual environment. And we were using it for the perception of nighttime driving blindness for the optician. How many people suffer from nighttime driving blindness with oncoming traffic, get starry-eyed headaches, that kind of thing. But at 10 o'clock in the morning at the doctor's office, which lens do you prescribe? That you're not in that scenario. But in virtual reality, I can have you driving down the turnpike with oncoming traffic at 11 o'clock at night. And now with our technology, we can swipe what is the best lens for you to make an informed decision. And within 48 hours, I made the decision. We got access to 3 of the colorimetric lenses for dyslexia. And that was pivot. It was a no-brainer. This is where we needed to go, and that's the advent came about.
Okay, so you mentioned the pivotal moment between where it led you to the creation of VisionWare X. So how has your background influenced your approach to developing the VR-based diagnostic tools?
Yeah, a couple areas there. Number one, I take a very scientific approach. It's got to be data driven. The fact that I knew early on I'm not a dyslexic expert, I needed expertise. Though my parents, as I mentioned, are teachers. They weren't necessarily in the LD world. They knew enough to be dangerous regarding information on dyslexia and similar learning disorders. My first foray was I needed to find expertise. So number one, what as a scientist, what do? You start reading papers, right? You delve into as much learning as you can on what it is, and then you reach out to the community. You find the experts that are out there, and you simply Google what are the top 10 experts in papers in the industry in the marketplace for dyslexia, and I reached out to all 10 of them, and I was met with some serious resistance because in 2020, again, VR is a gaming unit. It's not perceived to any true value from a clinical perspective. So it was very difficult for me to cut into that. As it turns out, I went back to Mariki and was describing my experiences and banging my head against the wall. Why aren't these people listening? And she put me in touch with the foremost authority in South Africa with regards to dyslexia. And that sparked a several week dialogue and convincing them that yes, they were open to at least exploring, didn't have an understanding one iota to begin with, but over time they started to digest that this could be possible. And within 8 weeks, we had a prototype that we took their paper-based paradigm and what I call VRified it, right? And now we've taken a subjective based test on paper to a much more analytical based test. We could see what are the eyes doing in real time. We can measure exactly how long to the precise fraction of a second did it take them to answer the question. We can score the test now using AI. Are the reversals of letters and that kind of thing. So what I uncovered in that entire process is that there's a lot of unknowns in dyslexia and a lot of misconceptions and a lack of understanding that dyslexia is not one thing. It's three things put under one umbrella. And if I were to describe dyslexia in simplest terms, it's one of three subtypes. And you can have one of the three, two of the three, or all three. So it gives you a permutation of 7 different types of dyslexia. You're an eidetic dyslexia, which is a visual dyslexic, or you're an auditory dyslexic, or you're a motor dyslexic. And those combinations now from a geneticist, which is what my classical training, totally makes sense now, right? Because now it's not one gene, it's 3 different genes, possibly even a 4th gene associated with one umbrella definition of dyslexia. Whereas before, everybody just said you're dyslexic, but they didn't say what subtype. And the genome has been known for some time now, and yet there's not a single gene associated with dyslexia. It's because the population is polluted. You have not identified a subcategory of just eidetic dyslexias. That's the group you need to identify. What is the gene associated with that subtype? Or just auditory dyslexics or motor dyslexics. They all exist, and South Africa's got that population. But from a genetic perspective, I'm like, that's what drives me. That's cool, is to understand that it's not one problem, it's 3 problems compounded. But I'd like to see what is actually going on at the gene level as well.
I mean, mapping out the human genome is such an interesting topic, right? It's so interesting how you're using that for dyslexia, and you figured out that there's 3 genomes for dyslexia: auditory, visual, and what's the last one again?
Motor. So a
Motor.
motor dyslexic, yeah, motor dyslexic is real simply the number one characteristic of motor dyslexic, and those listening will identify this, are the reversals of letters. B's become D's, P's become Q's, C's are written backwards. Symmetric letters like capital A is symmetric. You can reverse it horizontally or vertically, and it's still an A. But a B, you flip it vertically, and it becomes a D, right? So that's a motor dyslexic. And the reason why our society struggles with this is that not all are one or the other. It's you can have combinations, like I mentioned. You can have two of the three, you can have three of the three, or you can have just one of the three. So our paradigm now identifies what subtype, what permutation, and at what level. So we can screen up to 5 different severity levels. How bad do you have it, and then prescribe what is the best course of action prescribed specifically to you. So it's personalized medicine towards you.
Okay, so let's dive deep into this. For our listeners unfamiliar with VisionWare X, how would you describe your mission and services?
Yeah, great question. Our mission is, and this is going to sound like an oxymoron, but our mission is not to cure dyslexia. And it sounds really strange, right? That we might have a tool that could cure. It's not to cure. And I always throw back the question to anybody who asks that. You would not want me to cure Albert Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci, Walt Disney. You wouldn't want me to cure those individuals, would you? Because they're brilliant minds, and there is no correlation between IQ level and dyslexia. What you want me to do is to eliminate reading as an obstacle or a burden for them reaching their fullest potential. So that's our mission, is to reduce the amount of pains associated with learning and reading. And number 2 is unlocking their superpower. We as a society focus in on their kryptonite, which is that reading disorder, that reading disability, right? But it's also been found out that most dyslexics have a superpower. Number 1, they think outside the box. They problem solve differently. I mentioned those individuals like Einstein and Da Vinci. They certainly they certainly had superpowers that we as non-dyslexics would love to have. And most dyslexics, one of the superpowers that they traditionally have is that they can see and they visualize 10,000 images per minute. That's something that I wish I had, that superpower. That's why you'll see a lot of actors, directors that are highly proficient. Steven Spielberg, for instance, Tom Cruise are dyslexic, but they see visually almost as if it were a movie and can process a lot more visual imaging cues. So we want to change the educational paradigm to 1, eliminate reading as an obstacle, but 2, to unlock and further enhance their superpower, if that makes sense.
Okay, so as far as you are looking to expand into the education market with your VR headset, how do educators and caregivers integrate your tools into their existing frameworks?
Yeah, currently the paradigm would be to screen at the school level, right? Schools are highly motivated to do an initial screen. There's legislation being passed statewide all over the place. I as you mentioned before, I'm in the state of Michigan where we rank 50th out of 50th. We are dead last on how we treat with dyslexia. So there's legislation out there to say we need to do a better job of that. Modus operandi that they need to implement is screening. We need to identify those who are at risk. All right. So our tool enables them to do that cost effectively, accurately, and quickly. So within 10 minutes, we can assess whether or not someone's at risk. Okay. Now schools will fight back and say, we don't want to have anything to do with that diagnosis. That's a liability issue. That makes sense. They'd have to refer that out for a diagnostic perspective, but it can come right back to the school for virtual reality therapy in the future as well.
Yeah, I know they do like diagnostics for like hearing aids or like tics. They do like with the mobile vans. Do you guys plan on like going to the schools and having it set up like that, like going directly in?
That's one business model. Right now, we're in the process of ramping up a full-on clinical study, multiple schools, roughly 2,500 to 3,000 kids across multiple schools, across multiple school districts. Primarily, we want to show that dyslexia has no correlation to socioeconomic, demographic, ethnicity. So we want to go across a handful of different schools in a region so that we can show, and it's empirically true, that there is no biases with regards to dyslexia. Okay. But we would come into the school and we will train the LD specialists how to do the test, get certified in our program. It's about a 6-week program, a self-guided online educational, kind of like continuing education for them that they go through, they can complete, and then they become certified on how to utilize and what they're exploring, delving deeper into those 3 different subtypes, why they're the subtypes that they are, the severity levels. And then there's also a broader picture. So not just for the LD specialists, but for all teachers. What happens when you've identified certain children in your classroom that are struggling with dyslexia or dyscalculia or dysgraphia? What do? Right? Well, there are some simple things that you just need to be privy to so that you don't do certain things, right? You certainly don't want to embarrass a kid by having them get up and read in front of the class, right? But if you didn't know, you don't know, right? So, or you don't need them to go up to the board and write a sentence where they're going to be reversing their letters and embarrass them in front of the entire class, right? So those are things, just examples of things that a teacher needs to be aware of based on the prognosis of kids in their class. And the more they know, the more that they can tamper down, which is one of the big secondary obstacles of dyslexia and any learning disorder, is the shame, the humiliation, the potential bullying, and all those psycho and emotional ties to being labeled as someone with a disorder, right?
Mhm.
And you asked what part of our mission is, that that's also extremely important to us. 80% of the Texas Penal Code imprisoned are known learning disorders, which is primarily dyslexic. They're functional illiterates. 48% of teenage suicides are dyslexics. That's a gross disproportionate number. Why is that? It's the emotional burdens that are associated with being labeled that in a curriculum. No kid wants to be humiliated by that. And our system being a virtual reality, we have the opportunity to take it from, hey, I've got to go spend an hour a day or hour a week or whatever that time down in a different room, segregated from my peers, to I'm going to go do that. But guess what? I'm doing it in a VR environment. I'm in a gaming environment. Now I'm the cool kid. I'm doing something that they don't get to do.
That's awesome. That's very cool. So let's ask this question: how do you approach pricing for your services? I mean, such as the VR screening, the $30 VR screening, and the $599 diagnosis.
Yeah. I like to describe things as, in business school, day one is the 3-legged stool, right? You have accuracy, you have time, and you have costs. You never get all 3. You can get 2 of the 3 typically, but you never get all 3 at one time, unless there's a paradigm change. And that's what we're experiencing now, is that we have the ability to create a paradigm change. We can, what would normally take a diagnosis for dyslexia, which, 6 to 8 1-hour sessions. Let me ask you this. What child wants to go through 6 to 8 1-hour sessions out of a cost to a parent of $2,500 to $5,000, right? And it's 100% subjective. They're looking at a piece of paper and a clinician's making an assessment. I can take that same test to 3 different clinicians and possibly get 3 different answers, right? Our system can now boil it down to, within an hour, screen and diagnose at a fraction of the cost. $599. Why $599? Number one, we want to make it affordable for everybody, as close to as possible. No longer is it $2,500 to $5,000. We also know that 90% of insurance carriers will not reimburse. So it's got to be a dollar amount that parents can afford to at least absorb on the front end, right? $30 a screen seemed, for the amount of time, a quick down and dirty, we can get this done for that cost. And that was dialogue with several different schools. That seemed to be an acceptable cost per student.
Okay, let's break down some business operations. I mean, what are some day-to-day challenges your team faces in delivering VR-based diagnostics?
We still struggle on the front end getting people to understand the clinical application of VR. It's getting better, but we're still not there yet because it's not really been put into practice. So from an educator's perspective, they see the back end, the educational, the therapeutic side, right? That makes sense. But on the front end, the clinical side, that's been a difficult challenge. I'll say the next big one is technology is jumping so fast, so furious that keeping up with it, you've got to make a command decision. What platform are we going into? And we have to stay in lane for a good period of time. But within that time frame, in 2 years, our technology, the hardware itself could be outdated. So you have to code such that you can pivot with whatever's coming down. For instance, we're aware of some things that are coming down with new technologies coming from Apple, coming from uh, Meta, Facebook, that are coming that we're privy to, but we have to make a command decision from a software perspective. What is the platform we need to go onto and adopt for a variety of reasons, accuracy, speed, cost on the hardware side. That's that at current time is probably one of the biggest challenges for us because technology on a hardware perspective is just hard to keep up with, especially for a small startup that has got to be budget conscious.
Right. I mean, you guys are a startup, right?
Yes.
So what's the trends going on in the industry right now that you see as a startup that is that you'll believe that will impact your field the most in the next 5 years?
I think that as with that anything, capital is always the rate limiting step, right? Capital markets ebb and flow, and they'll get hot on a topic. And then the first lemur pulls his head up out of the hole and says, AI, let's focus over here and not on VR. So the whole market shifts and says, all right, well, in the end, you either believe it in what our mission, right, which is to address a large, very, very large, almost 20% of the population suffers from dyslexia or a similar learning disorder, of which 80% has gone undiagnosed. To me, that's a sin. And if we can bring that market to bear at a cost-effective, time efficient, and highly accurate measure, we need investors to understand that's yes, we can put in buzzwords and other applications like AI, and that those are all ancillary. It's still a mission. This is an altruistic mission to change the world, um, and not just change an individual's life. I mean, this is game changing.
Have you received any feedback from your clientele or your pilots?
Yeah, great question. I'll describe it this way. I've had the luxury of running through a pilot or preclinical trials, roughly 32 kids. And over my shoulder, I had during the screening portion, not the diagnostic portion, just so the parents get to see in general what was going to happen. And the way our system works is that they're in a virtual environment, so they've got the headset on, right? But I'm seeing what they're seeing on the iPad. So the parent can look over my shoulder and see what they're seeing. And we record the entire session, but we're not recording like you and I right now from third person perspective. We're recording from a simulated first person perspective. So we're putting a dot on the screen and we can see where their eyes are focusing on screen. And to have mothers and dads cry, weep over my shoulder because for the first time ever, they're seeing that the child is reading right, left, for instance, or their eye is fluttering over a word as they're struggling. No third grader has the vocabulary to describe what they're experiencing as abnormal because it's their normal. How would they know it to be anything different? But for a parent to look over their shoulder and see that, that's what keeps me up at night. That's like, that's motivation enough to say this needs to be done. And just as an example, one of those parents, the father, who knows he was dyslexic, looked over the shoulder, and he was one of the ones that teared up. He was like, I now get it. I see it. I can visualize it. I know I can empathize. And he got so tied up with it. For 6 months, he was lending help to the organization. He's now part of the organization. He's an integral part of the organization.
Perfect.
So those types of experiences that in the social media field, we call it, viral. In this, it's you latch on because it has an emotional tie to you, whether you've experienced it or your child has experienced it or a nephew or niece has experienced it. You want to get involved because you know what the downstream ramifications are.
What is your long-term vision for VisionWare X in the evolving landscape of educational diagnostics?
Yeah. So dyslexia was the first one. We've got dyscalculia and dysgraphia in the development works right now. So dyscalculia, the way you would think of dyscalculia is dyslexia for math. 901 might become 109. Well, you're lost if you're trying to do any basic math, if you're seeing things reversed, right? And then dysgraphia is more of a writing mechanic where you start writing inside the lines, and then by the time you get to the right-hand edge of the page, it looks like a downward bell curve, right? So there are similar learning disorders in the same vein as dyslexia that we've got the paper-based test out of South Africa that we now own. We own the intellectual property worldwide now on this, that we're in the process of VRifying right now. Are there other disorders that are in the pipeline as well? Yes, but they're on my whiteboard, but until we get fully funded and we're in a position to go down towards those. Case in point, dyslexia shows 30% correlation with things like ADD or autism. So there's a lot of comorbidities with similar disorders that needs to be explored. And virtual reality, in my belief, is probably the best medium to take us down and explore because we can control the environment.
You mentioned your whiteboard. Are there any upcoming projects or innovations you're particularly excited about?
Yes, but I'm not. I can't go into those because it would be premature for me to speak into them.
Okay.
To answer that, we in our preclinical trial, we've uncovered something that part of the reason why we need to go a much larger trial is if it rings true, which there's no indication why it wouldn't. We're talking the cover of Science or Nature. It will blow. It's going to be the largest disruption to specifically dyslexia, possibly in the learning disorder market that we've seen in decades.
All right, let's close it off with this last question. How can our listeners learn more about VisionWare X or get involved with your mission?
Certainly check us out, VisionWare X with a hyphen, so VisionWare -X.com. You can type in VisionWareX.com, it will go the same. Check us out there. We do have social media presence. Part of our dilemma is that we want to be prepared for the onslaught of people coming at us. So we've kind of kept things in a skunks works type operation for a reason. We certainly want to not be prepared for those individuals that want this and in their hands immediately. The soccer moms desperately want this. Let's say that. And I want to be prepared to give that to them efficiently, cost effectively, in a manner that we can handle the onslaught of individuals that want this as soon as this goes viral.
Amazing work. All right, thank you, Jeff, for hopping on this episode with Design to Thrive. That was Jeff from VisionWare X. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Have a blessed day.